What is going on, guys? Hikari5880 here, and today we're going to be doing a special video where we discuss how to get the most effective runs out of the Imp Parade in the 1 hour slot that you're given, and to basically squeeze out as many runs as you can and get more bang for your buck, or if you want to say bang for your 8,000 points that you use to buy that Imp key. So let's just get on with it and discuss the various teams that you can use with an in-depth analysis on which team is better to use for Imp Parade. So the first team setup you can use is with a Kikuri and a Mifune. Now this is one of the most common used team setups for Imp Parade. So the sphere setup you need on Kikuri is either a Lexida or a Virtue Stone. Alternatives can be a Hallowed Skull instead of a Lexida and a Soul Creator instead of a Virtue Stone. Along with Kikuri, who is going to be the lead of the team, you can have a Mifune as a sub-unit. Now this Mifune needs to be any type except a Guardian type, and you will need to imp the Mifune depending on his type as well. So for example, if Mifune is a Breaker type, then you will need to use 14 attack imps on him to be able to do these runs, and if he's another type, then you need to use 24 attack imps on him to get the required attack stat to do these runs. So the spheres that you want on your Mifune is a Blighted Seal and a Demon Core. So what the Blighted Seal does is it increases Mifune's attack high enough so that Mifune will deal 32,000 damage on your Metal God, and that is enough damage to basically pierce the Metal God's defense and to one-shot it. The Demon Core is there to basically assist in keeping Mifune's Super Brave Burst active throughout the run, and so you can use his Super Brave Burst in all 3 battles of the run. Now an alternative sphere setup for Mifune is using a Urias, which is, I believe, is Atrosphere, and Pakshan Weapon Enhancer. Now personally I haven't tested this out myself, but many players in the community have suggested that this sphere setup does work on your Mifune and does keep his Super Brave Burst active, though it probably won't help in piercing the Metal God's defense, which is why you have a Kikuri or an Elza on the team to assist with that. So Elza can be used as a replacement to Kikuri on the setup, and Elza is essentially used as the lead as well. So the sphere setup for Elza would remain the same with a Lexida or a Virtue Stone or a Soul Creator and a Hallowed Skull, and her role remains the same as Kikuri as well in the team setup. Another thing to note is that you can use a Wicked Blade instead of a Blighted Seal on your Mifune, though this does require you to have progressed in Arena to have obtained the Wicked Blade, and Blighted Seal is much easier to get since you just need to complete 1 trial in order to obtain that. So the final setup you can use is a Kira as a lead along with Dilma as a sub-unit. If you don't have a Kira, you can replace him with a Mariudis. So the sphere setup for Kira would be any sphere that boosts his attack considerably. Amano Habakan is a good choice. Same with a Dilma, you can use an Amano Habakan on him as well to increase his attack considerably, and this setup works perfectly to do your Imp Parade runs as well. So now that we've discussed the team setups, we'll go straight into the runs now. So what I'm going to do is show you 5 separate runs with these 3 team setups, and we're going to see which is the most efficient of the 3. Along with this, I'll discuss the pros and the cons of each setup, and I'll also talk about other factors which play a part in the speed of your runs. So as you can see now, there are 3 screens on display, the left being the Kikuri and Mifune setup, the middle being the Elza and Mifune setup, and the right being the Kira and Dilma setup. So all these runs were done in the same hour, on the same device, and all carried out as fast as possible to the best of my ability in order to make these tests as fair as possible. So I'll give you a time of each run carried out by these 3 setups, and I will also give you a final average time for all 3 setups as well near the end of the video. So while you guys watch these 3 setups in action and to get a good idea of where each team stands, I'll talk about the pros and cons of each team. So to start off, let's talk about the Kira and Dilma setup. So instantly it's quite obvious that the biggest disadvantage of this setup is that you have to use 2 Fujin potions to prepare for each run. So this can actually be pretty devastating on your Fujin stock in the long run, and you will pretty much burn through your Fujin potions pretty fast if you keep doing this run over and over again. Another pretty obvious disadvantage is that you're using 2 SBB, which means that you're going to extend the animation time because you're going to be using 2 SBB animations instead of 1, and this can actually add up in the long run even if it's just a few seconds. So while this team does have its disadvantages, it does also have advantages, surprisingly. The first being that you don't really need to prepare extensively for this setup. You don't need to imp any units, don't really have to spare any units either, and the spares that you can use for this setup are pretty straightforward. Amano Habakans work wonders for this setup. If you do have premium spares, they can pretty much help you a lot as well and get these runs done more efficiently as well. Another very small advantage as well is that you're very likely to take out burst frogs if they show up, and you're pretty likely to take out everything in your way. So now that we've discussed the pros and cons of the Kira and Dilma setup, let's move on to talking about the Kikuri and Mifune setup. So this is where things get a bit more interesting. So the quite obvious advantage of this setup is that you don't need 2 Fujin. 1 Fujin is just enough for this run. So all you do is Fujin Mifune and basically normal attack with Kikuri and use Mifune's Super Brave Burst. This actually saves time because you're not using a second Super Brave Burst animation, and it does cut the time down in the long run, so you can squeeze a few more runs out of your Imp key. Another pretty obvious advantage of this setup is that you can pretty much get away with replacing Kikuri with an Elsa, which I will discuss later on. Now, surprisingly, this setup does have disadvantages as well. The main thing being that you really need to prepare for this setup, meaning that you need to imp your Mifune, you do seriously need to Sphere Frog him as well, and you possibly need to Sphere Frog your Kikuri as well, and that can actually take quite a long time to, you know, obtain those Sphere Frogs and then set this up as well. But it is pretty efficient in terms of Fujin potions, and it will save you those Fujin potions in the long run. And a very small other disadvantage of this is that you do need some premium spheres, that being like Demon Core, which is gotten from Frontier Hunter later on. You could use the Wicked Blade as mentioned earlier, but again you need to get that from Arena, and you need to be of a high rank as well, so that can take pretty long to get. So Blighted Seal you can pretty easily obtain through trials. However, using the Pasquan Weapon Enhancer, that's pretty rare now. You won't really be able to get that, so it is pretty hard to set this team up. So that is something you need to consider. If you don't have the right spheres, I wouldn't bother imping your Mifune. You could try imping your Mifune and trying other setups. It could work out for you, you never know. The final very small disadvantage is that sometimes, very rarely, you won't be able to one-shot the Burst Frog, and that can end up stretching your time slightly because then you need to do more attacks on him to finish it off. But overall, this is considered one of the most efficient setups for Imp Parade, and is basically one of the most commonly used setups as well. And however, a lot of people don't have Kikuri, which is why we now have the Elsa and Mifune setup. So the Elsa and Mifune setup basically has the same disadvantages and advantages as the Kikuri and Mifune setup. However, the big difference here is that Elsa's attack animation is actually faster than Kikuri's, and of course Kikuri's attack animation has that small delay just after she attacks, as you just saw. So while you do have a faster attack animation, and it is literally just a few milliseconds that you wouldn't even notice it, but it can pay off in the long run, and it is more, in my opinion, it's the more recommended team. If you do have a Kikuri, however, I would recommend doing that as well, because with the Elsa setup you will more likely not be able to take down a burst frog if it shows up sometimes, because you're not getting that extra damage from Kikuri, and that can be pretty annoying. So the other advantage of this setup is that Elsa's, I would consider Elsa to be much more easily obtained than Kikuri, because she's generally easier to summon from my experience anyway. Probably the same for amongst other players as well. So that's another advantage you can consider as well. So as you can see, that if you look closely at each run that I've shown you here, there is a very equal time between the Kikuri and Elsa setup. There's literally hardly any difference to be noticed. So in terms of having to change between Elsa and Kikuri, I wouldn't dwell on it too much. But in terms of statistically speaking, the Elsa and the Mifune setup is faster, as long as you don't bump into burst frogs too often, which is the case because burst frogs are pretty rare to bump into. So now that we've discussed the pros and cons of the three setups, I know that there are other setups that you can use, but the three setups I suggested here are the most commonly used setups and also known to be the most efficient setups. I may have missed out a few minor points here or there, but I hope I've given you a general idea of each setup. So I've discussed that you can pretty much squeeze as many runs as you can from 1 hour Imp key. From what I've known, you can squeeze about 50 runs using a Kikuri Mifune setup or the Elsa Mifune setup, and of course you do need to gem if you're going to go for those 50 runs out of your 1 Imp key. You can get away with half energy and being close to leveling up as well, and you can pretty much get through the entire hour without gemming if that is the case and you're a high level as well. So another factor that plays a part in your speed and effectively how many runs you can get out of your 1 hour is your device speed. So if you've got a slow speed device that has lagging gameplay, that will pretty much add up to the overall time taken for each run, and you may lose a run or two as well if that is the case. The same thing applies to connection as well. If you're seeing a connecting message and it's longer than it should be, that means you have a slow connection, and that will likely add on a few seconds here and there, and that will probably make you lose a run as well. The final thing that does play a part is how much commitment you put into each key. So if you're going to just do runs half-assed, then you're probably just going to lose runs here and there because you're not paying attention. So you do need full attention for that entire hour to get the most runs you can out of that key. So now that we've discussed everything, we'll look at the average times now that we've collated from the test runs, and I'll give you a final verdict of these three setups. So the average times are now on the screen, guys. The times calculated for these average times were started from the second the Imp Parade run starts all the way to when it finishes. So the connecting screen and the result screen is not incorporated into the times. So we can see that there is a 1 second difference between the Elsa setup and the Kikuri setup. Does this make a difference? Well, you can potentially gain about 50 extra seconds using the Elsa setup for the entire hour period. This will mean that you can squeeze in possibly an extra run if you use the Elsa setup. However, you need to consider that the Kikuri setup will have a better time getting through burst frogs than the Elsa setup. We can see that the Kira setup is way slower than the Kikuri and Elsa setup, and would not be the preferred method to get the most efficient runs out of your Imp key. Now, the Imp Parade will change in the future. They will only last half an hour instead of an hour. There will be no metal gods, so that means you don't have to use an extra unit to take down that metal god. Instead, it will be replaced with a chance of bumping into an Artan Imp. This means that teams will likely change in the future, and you will most likely have faster runs as well, so you will be able to squeeze in more out of your Imp key than you can now. So that is it for this video, guys. Tell me what setup you guys use or what setup you guys prefer, and it would be interesting to know what setup, the variety of setups being used for Imp Parade. And likes and subs are greatly appreciated, and as usual, guys, I will see you guys in the next video. See ya.